So, I want to talk about the rocket. Now, basically all my speeches have included some reference to the rocket and the space programs. Because I'm a space science educator of the Cosmosphere, I thought talking about Robert Hutchins Goddard, or Dr. Goddard, as it's more appropriately called, would be the best topic for me to inform you guys about. Not only, I don't want to focus on the man himself, but on his impact, on his legacy, what his inventions have done, and where they translate into the real world. First, I want to talk about his idea of current cooling, his use of liquid fuels, and then also I want to talk about the use of a gyroscope for stabilization, and then finally I will talk about how they were all put together in the Apollo space program. First, he was the first gentleman to come up with the idea of current cooling. Now, when we go to outer space, we use liquid fuels. The problem with liquids are they don't burn. So in order to get them from a liquid state, which are easy to carry, to a gaseous state, he thought, hey, I have a hot engine. Well, why not run the fuel around that hot engine, and then that will cause the liquid to evaporate and allow it to burn as soon as it enters the engine. Pretty simple idea. Very difficult to come up with in the beginning. The problem with his first concepts of current cooling was his location of his engine. His engine originally was sat on top of his fuel. So, as I showed in the previous picture, his engine is up here. His fuel is right here at the bottom. So that was the whole change in his rocket design. He went from a bottom-up component of allowing it to evaporate and then rise the engine to a top-down approach with the current cooling. Now, we use this today in the space program. Space shuttle engines have some form of current cooling, and without it, we'd never get off the ground. In order to lift something the size of a grapefruit, it would take enough oxygen in a gaseous form the size of Yankee Stadium and a fuel of approximately the equal volume to get something the size of the grapefruit. So obviously current cooling was very important for Robert Goddard and for the space program today. Without it, we never went to the moon, and Neil never took this giant leap. Next, now Robert Goddard had a problem with stabilization. In his hometown, in the state of Massachusetts, it's almost completely illegal, aside from in 2 areas that I'm aware of, to launch model rockets because of Robert Goddard. Now, the problem that Robert Goddard had was he couldn't figure out how to get his rockets to fly straight and to fly vertical. His problem was they'd get off to the launch pad, and then they'd veer off and hit his aunt's garden. Now, this happened on several occasions. His aunt's garden was the least of his worries. He hit town hall, he hit some of the post office, local post office, and everybody in Massachusetts was like, get out of our state. So he went to New Mexico, and while he was in New Mexico, he started working with gyroscopes. Now, gyroscopes offer the benefit of the internal rotation, which prohibited the movement outside of the component of the rocket. Now, this is a very simplified form, so for those of you AEs, please don't murder me. He attached the gyroscope to the end of the rocket. As the inside stayed the same, he had wires attached to it. It would then pull on the rocket engine and causing it to fly straight because of the internal momentum. And then he was also the first person, I guess I should have mentioned this first, was the first person to use liquid fuels. We used the Saturn V, the space shuttle, all liquid fuels. The problem with the solid rockets that were using fireworks by the Chinese of the day was once you light it, you have no control over it. With his use of liquid fuels that started back in the 1920s, he was able to control the flow and decrease the risk of a disaster. And ultimately, if we get to the point with the space shuttle, or if we would have reached a point with the space shuttle or the Saturn V, where it's becoming disastrous, we could knock off one of those systems or one of the engines or stages without running the risk of harming the rest of the world, because it wasn't just a giant missile that we essentially set fire. So, Robert Goddard's legacy, some people say it's Wernher von Braun's legacy, but in my opinion, it's the Saturn V. Saturn V had every major component used within it. Every single one of his engines had a gimbal or a gyroscope on the end. It allowed it to gimbal and rotate to keep it stable. It used current cooling, and it also used liquid fuel. Now, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and all the Apollo astronauts who walked to the moon wouldn't have been able to do this without Robert Goddard. Thank you.